In this video, I'm going to discuss theory and research as it pertains to the theory building process. And to do that, I'm going to talk about this particular diagram. This is a diagram which illustrates the process from beginning to end, but you'll notice that there really is no beginning and no end to this diagram. That is, the arrows here in the middle illustrate that the process is continuous. So one might wonder, where do we even begin if there's that process? Well, in this case, we actually start up here at the top under making assumptions, and then we're going to move around the cycle in a clockwise fashion. So I'm going to talk about the first four elements of this model here in this particular video, and then I will follow up with the last four elements in the next video. So that's going to be making assumptions about the nature of knowledge and how we come to know. The second item is going to be asking questions from curiosity or discrepant events. The third element is conducting systematic observations. And the fourth component is proposing explanations for observed events. Now, while you may have had some exposure to theory building concepts in the past, we're going to be applying this as it specifically focuses in on social science in general and educational psychology in particular. To do that, I'm going to use a specific example so that as we move through this diagram, I'm going to be using that particular example to help illustrate each element of the diagram. So to begin with, we're going to start up here at the top with making assumptions about knowledge and how one comes to know. In the work that we've done already, we've discussed the notion that beliefs are critical to learning and that beliefs in many ways drive forward the learning process. Well, beliefs come oftentimes from assumptions. The difference oftentimes is that sometimes we can be very clear about our beliefs, or that is, we can articulate them or we understand them. If somebody asks you what you believe to be true, you may be able to tell somebody quickly and easily. Assumptions are not always as easy to unearth. And the reason is, by definition, an assumption is something that you believe to be true so deeply, so implicitly, that you just take it as a given. And so oftentimes we don't even question these things. We don't even bring them up. They're not worth talking about because of course they're true. And and a great example of that is the sun rises in the east. In our experience, it's always true. The sun always rises in the east. And so we don't even think about it. We just move on with our day, expecting the sun to rise in the east every single day. And that's an assumption about how our world works. And so if something is that deeply held a belief that it's an assumption, then it's underground. We just don't think about it. And maybe that isn't a big deal, except that it colors what we do. It colors how we understand the world. And that in of itself also might not be a bad thing, except that when we're building theory and doing research, we're supposed to be objective. That is, we're supposed to take a neutral perspective as to try and discover the truth. And if you are starting that process with some underground beliefs that we call assumptions, then perhaps you're not starting from that unbiased perspective, but instead you're starting from a biased point of view, which is going to then shape the rest of the theory. This is a conundrum that researchers face. How do we deal with that? We want to be objective. We want to have theories that are going to help us to try to unearth as much of the truth as we possibly can. Then we have to do something about assumptions at the beginning. So the theory of science that we're looking at here proposes that the best thing that you can do is to A, reflect on what your assumptions are. If they're underground, if they're in, if you don't think consciously about them all the time, you have to kind of unearth them. So you've got to think about, well, what is it that I believe to be true? In this case, what do I believe to be true about learning, about the nature of how people come to know and understand the world? And so if you can unearth those deeply held beliefs and then sort of lay them out on the table for yourself and for everybody else to see, then we're not so much being unbiased, but at least we're saying, here are my biases. Here are the things that I believe to be true, and I'm aware of them, and you can be aware of them, and let's proceed from this point. So it doesn't eliminate the bias, but it sort of minimizes the impact because they're seen rather than unseen. So it's a very important point that all research begins from this perspective, not because of the individual beliefs that somebody has, but because human beings, by their nature, make assumptions, and therefore human beings, by their nature, are biased to some degree or another. And we simply have to minimize that process. That being said, once we've sort of laid our assumptions on the table, what are we going to build a theory about? We have to pick a topic. We have to choose something that we want to talk about or that we want to deal with. And so what any given individual researcher chooses to do is generally based on one of two things. It's based on questions that we ask purely for the sake of curiosity. Oh, I wonder about this, or how did this happen? And just because we're interested, we're just curious. And researchers, like other people, tend to choose things to do that involve their own interests, their own perspectives. And so they're going to choose things that they're interested in. It's a good point because they're going to spend a lot of time doing this research, and so they better be interested in the thing that they're doing. So curiosity often drives forward what our questions are that help us to get to our topic or our issue that we're interested in doing research on or interested in building a theory for. The other thing is what we would call a discrepant event. A discrepant event is two things that don't fit together. They just don't make sense together. That we understand two things as being disparate, that they're disconnected, and yet here we are finding them together. Right? So a classic metaphor would be oil and water don't mix, but suddenly you observe oil and water mixing. How does that make any sense? How do I understand that? Okay, so those two kinds of things tend to drive forward the questions that researchers ask, that theorists ask. And it's that initial question that the theory is going to be built on, even though there will be lots of refinements along the way. But we don't really leap directly into the theory or directly into that process. We actually have to go through a sort of intermediate step to collect some initial information before we proceed. And so the next step in the model attempts to articulate that, and that is called conducting systematic observations. And the systematic observations are of two kinds. First, any research question that you ask from any perspective, you need to go into the literature of the field and discover what research has been done already. You need to know what we say the status of the field. That usually requires going into what we would call research journals, journals that are within any field. There are specific research journals that are designed particularly for that field. They're journals in which are peer-reviewed, in which individuals conduct research. They submit articles for publication. Those articles are reviewed by panels of their peers, blind, so that nobody knows who the researchers are. And then once approved, an editor coaches them through the process of putting that article out. It's actually a very long and arduous process, so that what that does is it makes us sure that the research that comes out the other end is of high quality. So when I say research journal, I mean journals that are basically designed for people in the field. to produce that research and then for other people to read it. So if I want to do a research study on a question that I've come up with, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to do keyword searches, and I'm going to try to find as much literature as I can, and I'm going to read that extensively. And I'm going to organize it and summarize it, and I'm going to try to determine, do we need another theory in this particular area, or is there extensive research in this area already, so we really don't need that? So I'm going to use my example here, and both in terms of the questions part of it and the conducting systematic research. So let's say I'm observing in a classroom, and I've just noticed that the teacher in the classroom likes to spend a few minutes every day reading aloud to her students, and that in and of itself may not be in particularly extraordinary or unusual, except these are middle school students. And so while we might think it particularly usual for an elementary teacher to read to students, we might think it unusual for a middle school teacher to read to students. In part because we expect middle school students to already know how to read, and so they could read the books themselves. Why would they need to be read to? And so I observe in a classroom where a teacher is reading beautifully to children, and middle school kids are listening in rapture. And I'm wondering why that is. And in particular, I'm wondering what the impact of them listening to that teacher might be. That is, might their listening to the teacher read actually encourage them to read? And if they read, maybe it will improve their reading comprehension, that is, their ability to understand text. And so my question might be, does reading to older children improve their reading comprehension? So I would then go out into the literature on reading comprehension in middle school age students and see if there's any research on read-alouds, on teachers using read-aloud as a strategy to facilitate comprehension, that is, understanding of text, in students when they're reading independently on their own. So not comprehension of the text while the teacher is reading aloud, but actually comprehension in their own reading later. And so I go out, I do those keyword searches, I find literature, I read that, and I discover, well, there's some research that maybe suggests that that might be impactful, but there's only 2 or 3 studies, and they're coming from different points of view and perspectives, and their research findings are uneven. That is, they don't all point in the same direction. That's a good sign now that we could use another theory and some additional research. So if I find that kind of limited information, then it encourages me to move forward with my theory. If, on the other hand, I went out and I found 50 studies and most of them were trending in the same direction, I might say, well, it doesn't look like this is an area where we need additional research. There's a lot of evidence here in the 50 studies that are out there. I'm going to focus my attention elsewhere. Not that 50 is the golden number. As I said before, there's no golden number. But you can see in those 2 examples, 3 or 4 versus 50, that's a pretty significant difference. And so that might help me to decide, do I move on to the next step or not? So then that next step would be the all-important point of proposing explanations to observed events. In this case, what I mean by proposing explanations to observed events is we're actually proposing a theory. And if you think back to the last video where we talked about what a theory is, that means that there are propositions or positions or concepts that are built together, strung together to try and explain, predict, and control for some phenomenon. And so I have to sort of put in place the building blocks of my theory. I have to say,
here are the elements of the theory. So going back to my example, I might, having read all that literature and based on my own assumptions, have a set of ideas that I say, well, I think that the reason that middle school age kids' comprehension improves when they listen to oral reading on a regular basis by their teacher is that they are actually uh, going through a process of converting text in their minds when the teacher reads. That is, that the teacher, you hear that auditory words, and then you're actually converting that to text in your mind. So I would need to have a theory that uh, used elements, different concepts, different ideas to build an argument for why that would be true, why this notion of oral communication to text in the mind might be true. And so my theory would be built up of different elements, and I'd have to argue for each one of those and have theoretical research findings in other areas to support that, and I'm going to construct my theory. But constructing your theory, proposing the elements of the theory, as you can see, is not the end of the process. We're only halfway through. So building a theory, or that at least the initial version of a theory, is not the end. It's the middle of that process.